It's still staying on revenue generation, and you mentioned the fact that the mining sector, which will be one of the sectors that will be really benefiting from the current situation, should be one of the places we should be targeting at. Probably increasing taxation or finding means of taking some other revenue to cushion what is currently happening. Will that mean that we find a proper way of getting our carried interest, our 10% carried interest, like we have done in the oil sector, from the mining sector in a proper way? And what regulation should be changed towards this?
Well, it's a balancing act. You cannot kill the hen that lays the golden eggs. Then you deprive yourself of future eggs. And so we need to do things in a way that does not kill the mining industry. Even while we try to find money within the mining sector, we need to also think about their own sustainability. In the past decade or so, we've undertaken major fiscal policy reforms in the mining sector. I'm not too sure what the impact has been on their operations, positive or negative. I think that study ought to be undertaken. I'm also not too sure what the impact has been on government revenue. Again, that study ought to be undertaken to inform future policy going forward. But I made the point that we have had to vary the royalty rate, which used to be a range of 3 to 6%, to a fixed rate of 5%. This means more revenue to the state. We've had to increase corporate income tax from 25% to 35%. Again, more revenue for the state. Sometime in 2015, we took a decision recognizing that we're losing out on the time value of money by requiring mining companies to pay their royalty on quarterly basis. So they hold on to our money for 3 months. If we were to buy treasury bills with this money, you can imagine how much money you can make on these hundreds of millions of dollars. So we decided through a policy decision, which was announced by the Minister of Finance then, I think in the 2015 budget, that henceforth mining companies were going to pay their royalties on monthly basis.
But this was not enacted in a law.
Exactly. The necessary amendment to statute that will give effect to this policy decision was never done. And even as we speak, it's not been done. Which speaks of how sometimes careless we can be as a people and therefore losing a lot of revenue. Look, if you were to amend the law to give effect to this policy decision, what it means is that you can have, your cash flow will improve. So you have money coming almost monthly and helps you to deal with emergencies like we're finding now. I understand what the GRE has done in the absence of the legislative backing to this policy decision is to require just engage the companies and use moral suasion to get them to agree to pay monthly. I'm aware Newmont, for instance, is paying monthly, but I'm not too sure that all of them are paying monthly. And those who are not paying monthly are right, because the law says they should pay quarterly. There's been no change in the act.
Doctor, you've still not dealt with my issue of taking a look at our carried interest in the mining sector. Is this something we should take a real look? Because it is only when people declare dividend, out of which 10% is given to us as a country. Should we rather not be looking at what has been achieved in the oil sector, or from scratch putting our 10% foot out and saying that we are part of the production and so we should have that kind of revenue?
Right. Most of the fiscal reforms that I talk about have been brought about by the Ghana EITI. Every year, every now and then, as we produce our reports, we do make policy recommendations and we engage the key stakeholders, including government, to ensure that we implement these policy recommendations. The most recent policy recommendation that has been made by the Ghana EITI is indeed has to do with the 10% free carried interest in all mining concessions, which according to the EITI report, haven't counted for much in terms of revenue to the state.
Right.
Because the only times when we've gotten something out of this 10% carried interest have been those moments when companies have declared dividends. And you know, the declaration of dividends is not automatic. And so if the boardroom decides that, look, we're not going to pay our dividends this year, that's it. We don't get it. And so it so happens that there's been lots of companies that haven't declared dividends for a very long time. And therefore, it appears that our 10% interest in those concessions or those contracts haven't really yielded anything for us. The Ghana EITI is looking at various policy options. One of them, for instance, would be to treat our 10% carried interest as equity in the same way that we do in the oil sector. So, for instance, we would take our 10% in kind, which would be a share of production. That is one way we want to look at it. Let me make the point that, indeed, in the mining sector, we collect our royalty and all the fiscals in cash, even though the law allows us to collect them in kind. And this is also something we need to look at, because the gold that is produced belongs to you. You don't take your share of the production. You allow the companies to go sell, come and tell you how much they got for the output, what they sold, and then pay you your share in cash. That hasn't been really helpful. The oil sector, what we do is that we don't collect the cash. We collect our share of production, sell it ourselves, and then decide on what to do with the money. So all these are policy considerations currently on the table. We're working on a policy paper, which when finalized, there's a draft now, but when finalized, the Ghana EITI will be engaging the economic management team, the Minister of Finance, and other key stakeholders to see how we can ensure that our 10% carried interest in mining concessions count for some revenue to help us deal with some of the fiscal challenges that confront us as a country.
There's also a regulation from the mining sector that takes a look at companies investing 500 million and above get to have a certain special concession, and for which others that don't fall in that category have a different dispensation when it comes to the 5% royalties. Exactly how should we be treating this? Because then if companies decide to make more inputs, how does that concern us as a country in any way? I decide to expand my company, and then that becomes even an incentive for expansion. Shouldn't that rather attract more taxes from me? And so this whole discussion when it comes to that part of the regulation, I'm not getting properly, and shouldn't this be one of the things we should also be looking at?
Yeah, we should be looking at it. This relates to our Minerals and Mining Act as 703 of 2006, which actually provides that if any company invests $1 billion, $500 million or more in its project, it becomes entitled to what we call development agreement. And within this development agreement, we have what we call stability agreements. Now, the effect of stability agreements really is to freeze your fiscal loss, so that in the event of you having to do any fiscal reforms, to the extent that those fiscal reforms will negatively impact on the company, they are exempted. So it became more like a one-way street, that if you pass new tax laws, and these new tax laws will be at the disadvantage of a company, which means they will be taxing the companies more, the company that has stability agreement with the government is exempted. But if you were to lower your tax laws, they can take advantage. So anything that goes to their disadvantage, they're exempted. But it will inure to their advantage, they can take advantage of it. And that, in my view, was treating those agreements as a one-way street, and did not ensure that in the event of commodity boom, right, the country is able to derive commensurate profits. As a result of the Ghana EITI recommendations, there was a decision to take another look at the stability agreements with the two major companies that had them, Newmont and Anglo Gold Ashanti. And now the way they've been amended makes it more like a two-way street, and they are tied more to the prevailing market conditions. So if the market conditions change, of course we can initiate renegotiations to ensure that we're able to obtain commensurate benefits from the boom. And so that is one way in which we are making some progress. While just about the time when the Newmont and the Anglo Gold thing was concluded, then you had Goldfields also pushing for a development agreement. So according to them, cumulatively, when they look at their investments, they've exceeded the $500 million mark, and therefore they are entitled to development agreement. Now, there's a certain lack of clarity in terms of the position of the law, and this lack of clarity is further reinforced by the fact that for a very long time we didn't have regulations to the Act, and therefore it's been subjected to varied interpretation. First and foremost is we are not too sure whether the $500 million required for a development agreement is to be taken into account at the point of the investment. So you don't do piecemeal investment, but you come and say, this is my money, perhaps kept in an escrow account, and then we monitor its use. There wasn't such arrangements in terms of how to ensure that companies do these investments. And so you have a situation where a company can come to you, may have been in operations for 50 years and begin to say, hey, over the time I've been here, cumulatively this is what I have invested, so give me a development agreement. So we need some more clarity on that. I recall some members of the Ghana negotiating team were highly incensed by the fact that we gave in so easily to Goldfields. And in the process, a paper I read authored by Professor Akila Kwasoya on this matter, I think estimated that we may be losing some $25 million annually in the Goldfield Development Agreement alone, based on the fact that we did not take our time to go through it properly.